To this webinar between the European Forum on Nature Conservation and Pastoralism and the Heritage Council. My name is Gwyn Jones. I'm a director of the European Forum. Maybe I should just explain a bit what the European Forum is. It's a body that's been going for over 20 years. And our purpose originally and now is to raise awareness of the links between certain forms of farming, low intensity farming, and biodiversity, and also to raise awareness that these systems are fragile, they're marginal, and so they have distinct policy needs. So we've been doing that for a long time, and for the last 20 years, we've been doing some stuff in Ireland. And so part of the reason for this meeting tonight is that we're doing something for Heritage Week. We're getting funding from the Heritage Council this year again, and that's part of the conditions of the grant. But over and above that, it's 20 years since we started working in Ireland. So 20 years ago this year, there was a conference in the Burren. And since then, we've been working on and off. And throughout that time, we've been partnering with the Heritage Council. So as you can see, there's 6 of us here tonight to speak together. All of us were involved at some point in that 20 years, some of us for quite a long period and some of us for a short time. And I'll introduce the guests as they come into the story. I think that's the way we'll do it. And then at the end, we'll have a more general chat about how things are and how things have changed from how they were, and also what the future holds for high nature value farming. So maybe I should also explain this term, high nature value farming. It's a term that emerged from a policy centre first and got lost and then came back in policy. And it's farming that's high in biodiversity. And almost all of that farming is associated with semi-natural habitats. So habitats where nature's processes have free rein to operate. So let's start 20 years ago. Liam Lysaght, you're now in the Biodiversity Ireland, the Biodiversity Record Centre for Ireland. But 20 years ago, you were the Heritage Council Wildlife Officer, and it was you that invited the conference to Ireland, to the Burren. So what was your interest? How did you get interested in this topic, and why the Burren?
You're on mute.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the introduction, Gwyn. That's one way to, if you're leading the story, that's one way to make sure you feel old. I suppose on a personal level, I've always actually been interested in the link between agriculture. Well, I suppose actually I should say I've always been interested in agricultural landscapes because I did my PhD on birds and farmland. But of course, the farms that I worked on were mostly enclosed fields, rushy fields, and we were chasing birds around hedgerows really because that was all that was there. So I've always, and then I moved on. I was a ranger in the Burren National Park. So obviously I was based within the protected area, but then there was the wider landscape which was being farmed in an extensive way. So the link between, I suppose, nature conservation, biodiversity and farming was always very much in terms of my professional career and my academic interests. So it was no great life plan really. It was just an evolution really of interests from doing a PhD to working in an environment where farming is very important, and then moving on to the policy side.
And what was the context at that time? I mean, was it a happy relationship? And were farmers aware of their relationship to wildlife, for example?
I think there was a lot, particularly in the context of the Burren, there was an awful lot of things happening at the time. There was a lot of limestone pavement being cleared at the time, particularly around the fringes of the Burren. There was a lot of conflict down there because there was a proposal to build a visitor centre for the national park. That became extremely divisive. That started, I think, in 1991 or so, and lasted for 4 or 5 years. And I think the mood of the farmers in the Burren was very pessimistic, and they felt that almost persecuted because they were just trying to farm in their eyes. And of course, it's such a wonderful area. it was a kind of a focal point for a lot of angst around nature conservation at the time.
I mean, I only attended the conference. I wasn't involved in the preparation of it, but I got the impression that things like designation and the compulsory destocking and all these kind of things had just built up a momentum against this positive relationship that you saw on the ground.
Yeah, I think really the overall message outside the farming community was a negative one, and they felt slightly persecuted. But I think though it's important before the conference in the Burren, there had been some work done, and I think the Heritage Council, actually the council itself, has to take a lot of credit for making inroads to work with the farmers, because as I say, we were in the context of having a lot of conflict over the Mullaghmore Interpretive Centre, but the council actually went and engaged with the farming community. And way back, I think around 1998, we agreed a small little programme of a kind of manifesto for farming in the Burren. So there was the impetus, there was the starts there of kind of trying to break down the negativity and to try to come forward with a shared vision, I suppose, for the Burren.
At that time, reps had already started, hadn't it? I remember a story that's oft-quoted since then of my colleagues going with yourself, I think, to see a farmer, and the farmer saying, "Oh, now, do you want to come and see my habitat?" And then walking across the lovely limestone pavement and going to a bit that reps had told him to fence off.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of mixed message. Huh?
There was a lot. I think it was really at the infancy, the whole agri-environment thing. I don't think there was a clear concept of what to do from any quarter really within Ireland at the time. The Heritage Council had commissioned a review of the reps for the prescriptions for the Burren, I think back in 1998. So there was it was the start of kind of trying to build the evidence base, I suppose, build the evidence for what was happening in the Burren as a way of moving policy forward.
And what did you think, as wildlife officer, the role of the Heritage Council should be at that time? You're quite a small organisation, aren't you? You're a one-man band as wildlife officer. So what was your role, did you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was advising the council. And again, I think it's important, there was a council of 18 members. And the council itself had fairly recently been established. It was really dynamic. It was pushing out the boats and trying to find a role for it itself. It was questioning policy. It was trying to push into areas. It was light. It was agile. It was doing all these things which could respond and hopefully, you know, lead to providing ultimately advice to government, which was its function. So the Heritage Council was really trying to find its own role in terms of how to move the agenda forward. And it was a really exciting time, actually. Looking back on it, I didn't really realize and how much latitude we had. The council was very open to getting advice and to listening to the staff. So, and there was a great sense of unity, I think, within the council itself and within the staff. And I think we were taking a fresh approach to looking at environmental issues in extensive farming areas.
Because in 2003, after the conference, you commissioned some reports, didn't you, to look at the rural development plan and then at the midterm review. And I seem to remember you were very open, actually. We were allowed to say more or less what we wanted, whether you found it embarrassing or not. Well,
it wasn't embarrassing. You got me in trouble a few times, but I suppose that was probably all that went with the territory, because we had to, I mean, there was no hidden agenda. The case was to try to talk to the farmers, try to find out what was happening, and actually go and talk to the farmers, try to build a dialogue between, you know, the conservation side and the farmers and come up with practical solutions. And I think looking back 20 years now, there's a whole cohort of people really. There's a body, a critical mass of experts really on the whole agri-environment field, but I think was very fragmented 20 years ago. And what personally from my perspective, I got familiar with the forum initially through the chuff work that was being done up in Scotland and the work done by David McCracken and Eric Bignell. And then, you know, I was introduced to La Canada. I don't know, this newsletter. This was fantastic. This was all really important biodiversity hotspots. And if you look through the newsletter, what was extraordinary was there wasn't a photograph of a bird or wildlife. It was all livestock. So the forum really was opening up a whole vista to me that I was unaware of. And I felt there was a real opportunity for us to learn from what you were doing.
Yeah, Eric and myself, we went around to do your reports. We thought it was important to go and speak to farmers.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of help from Teagasc offices, people in the IFA Hill Committee, and some of them, we still meet them now, you know what I mean? But it was the first time that they'd heard anybody talk this kind of talk, really.
Well, just in thinking back on the forum meeting that we had in Ennistymon in 2000, I think two things really struck me as being important. The perception I get now, it may not have been the reality, but it seems to be the first time that an international audience came to the Burn and they wanted to hear what the farmers had to say. They weren't interested in the officials like myself. They were interested to hear what the farmers had to say. And I think that surprised perhaps, you know, the farmers, that what they had to say was actually important and it was genuine. But the other thing is that the audience was really struck by how passionate the farmers were. They were really, really passionate about the area and the link. It wasn't just farming. I mean, it was a lifestyle. And I know it sounds actually a small bit condescending maybe, but all of the farmers were so articulate and they were so well able to communicate what it meant to them to farm. And that was a lot of the audience said it to me, you know, that they were really surprised. And I know Michael Davern stood up and gave, as usual, he gave a wonderful presentation. It wasn't just Michael though. The farmers in their own farms were really passionate, and I think that it was a real credit actually to Ireland and farming community that people were so articulate and so passionate about farming in the area.
Yeah. Yes, because at that time, I think Brendan Dunford had only just started or was about to start. And I think you were involved in that in some way.
Yeah, well, actually, it would be nice really to rewrite the history accurately, in that the Heritage Council funded Brendan, I think, for 6 months initially to put together an EU Life programme bid. So again, I talk about the Heritage Council being flexible and being able to do things. And then once, I think Brendan was employed for 6 months, and then National Parks and Wildlife and Teagasc and the heavy hitters came on board, and you know, the rest is history. I mean, Brendan obviously just unlocked so much potential. I mean, there's no, you know, he's done wonderful work. But yeah, I think the Heritage Council, the council itself, really needs to probably get a bit more recognition for the groundwork that it did in the early days, laying the foundations perhaps for much better, much more successful progress down the line.
I mean, you left, I think, in 2006?
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
How did you feel you left it? My own perception from outside is that you'd sown the seed, but the crop was only just starting to germinate.
Well, again, at that time, Brendan had just been appointed, Brendan Dunford had just been appointed to the Council of the Heritage, or to the Council of the Heritage Council. And I know Brendan said to me one day, he laughed and he said, God, you've left me with this mess of what this high nature value farming is. I think we went from a phase where we were trying to engage with farmers and understand what was happening. And then I think we kind of got a small bit bogged down in what this term HNV meant, high nature value farming. And I think it became a small bit of a distraction. I think my feeling was a lot of effort in that if we are talking about this term, we have to be able to define it. And my sense is the last couple of years that I was involved, perhaps we lost direction slightly. And I think, well, I think when Cliona came back on, I think he all put it back on track a small little bit. Yeah, that's my sense at least.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a cue to go to Cliona. So Cliona O'Brien, you work for MPWS now, but you were the successor in post to Liam as wildlife officer. So was this a completely new thing to you when you found this on your desk, and what did you think? You need to unmute. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Gwyn. Yeah, so I started in July 2007, and I came from an entirely different background to Liam. While I had an interest in birds as a zoologist, my professional background was with the World Wildlife Fund, and I had worked predominantly on international wildlife trade and endangered species like rhinos and elephants. So moving back to Ireland and inheriting a strategic plan that committed to developing a policy on high nature value farmland was a bit of a baptism of fire for me. One very much wanted, but I suppose for me, I was coming new to that whole sector, obviously, in terms of agriculture. Didn't know the players, they didn't know me, and I had a direction, obviously, from the strategic plan to do a policy development on high nature value farmland. And also we had a commitment in our budget to look at the effectiveness of reps in Connemara. Now, at that time, word on the ground was that reps wasn't long for this world. So while we were, and I think as Liam said, there was a lot of discussion about what does high nature value farming mean at the time. And we were kind of grappling with what is it? When you look out in this field, is that it? In that field, is that it? And we got a bit lost in the meaning rather than understanding, well, what is it that's happening out there in those farms that we want to support and look after? So I kind of morphed the examination of reps in Connemara into an examination of high nature value farming in North Connemara and the Aran Islands. And that was really much, I have to say, at the direction of Brendan. He had been out to the Aran Islands, Brendan Dunford as the council member, who was instrumental in helping me to navigate my way through this in the first few years. Like, all credit to Brendan. So we commissioned case studies, short case studies on North Connemara and the Aran Islands. And as part of that, we went out to the farming communities and asked them their opinions for what kind of supports they wanted in place at those meetings. And the first couple of meetings were very quiet indeed. And, you know, I was sitting in the room in these public halls and nobody was saying anything. They were being asked questions by the consultants. And I don't know if it was me or if it was one of the consultants who said, is everything okay? Like, do you have anything you want to say to us? You know, after we'd explained why we were there and who we were and everything. And one of the farmers, who's still very much involved to this day in these kinds of discussions, said, we're just not used to anyone asking us our opinion before. This takes us a while to work out how to answer the kinds of questions you're asking. Now, I can't comment on the validity of that. I had never been to any of the public meetings on agri-environment policy development before, but that really struck me, that it really took the farmers a while to work out how to articulate what it is they wanted from an agri-environment policy, rather than what they didn't want. So anyway, we did those two case studies, and AOS was being developed, and I remember we did a paper to the Department of Agriculture at the time as the Heritage Council, and I remember we really stressed, you know, we want like bottom-up agri-environment schemes, we want farmer participation, we want results-based, we want adaptive management, we want monitoring. And the response was, well, that's all very well and good, but how do we do it because the burn is special? And we had to keep saying, well, yeah, the burn is special, but so many places in Ireland is special. All of Ireland is special. And you need to look at what each area has and what its values are and work out how to support that better. So, but it was really hard to make much progress as one person, as a one-woman band in the Heritage Council, despite the support from the council members, obviously. So I spent a lot of time investing in the development of a networks. So we set up the High Nature Value Farming Network, which you were involved with as the forum, academia, so Sligo IT with James Moran, the IFA, the Burn IFA, I think were involved as well. Teagasc were involved, National Parks and Wildlife Service. Anyway, Galway used to come along. So we used to talk like twice a year, and I think it really helped to get people on the same page and to stop trying to navigate the language, work out, okay, this is generally, we have an agreement of what we want to support, how do we make that happen? And then we brought Patrick in as the High Nature Value Farming Officer, and that was when we could really turn the principles we wanted an agri-environment scheme to embody into, well, what would this actually look like in somewhere like Leitrim? What would it look like on the Aran Islands? What would it look like in North Connemara? And then that turned into the Aran Life application. And well, the rest isn't quite history, but Patrick could maybe explain a bit more about that. So yes, exactly. I think the strength we brought to it in that time was really developing the network of so many different types of stakeholders who got around a table on a regular basis and came to trust each other.
Yeah. That's right. I don't mute yourself, Cliona, but
Okay.
I will bring Patrick in just now. So Patrick, were you there actually in Ennistymon in 2000?
I was indeed. I was there, yeah, because some things annoyed me at it and some things enthused me at it, you know, because I was working very much on action-based agri-environment schemes, which were criticised even 20 years ago then, you know. I remember, was it the fellow up in Scotland, the birdman up in Scotland, giving out about his farm and not being able to cut to a certain time. And I remember even approaching him afterwards to just discuss this with him, you know, and what my view was it. So yeah, I was there from the beginning. So
you worked with the department in Northern Ireland?
Yes.
And we got funding, we got funding from the Commission in 2010 from NGO Life Plus funding that we could match against Heritage Council money, as we were able to appoint an officer, and you were that officer. So you didn't come to it fresh exactly. You knew something about it, but what did you think the role that you should be playing was?
Yeah, that was, I remember after taking the job thinking what exactly where I was going with it. And then I was very conscious of the fact that it was something I read that Andy Blaisdell gave me by the poet Martin O'Drean, that another report dusting up on a shelf. So I felt something had to come from it more than just reports, which is why I was always very pleased that Darren Life came out of it, you know. But the very initial, it was just to go around, people go to different groups, particularly in North Connemara, Darren Islands and South Kerry. And that was just to go talk to the different farmers in that group. And I did spend a lot of time just talking to people, the Brendan O'Malley's, you know, the Joe McCracken in Kerry, you know, going out to meet farmers, and they would give me contacts and taking their views, and then try to formulate something, put together what some of the issues were, and how, with farmers meetings that we had, what would they see? So in Narran Islands, we'd say, what was the problems? How would you see how would they be addressed? And then feeding back those initially in a report stage, and then looking how we could develop further. And for the three areas, we did try to develop something further.
Another person that Cliona mentioned and who was quite to support you in your job was James Moran. So do you want to unmute yourself, James? With yourself, we have to really go back to the arc again, because you were there in the Burren, weren't you, at the start, doing your research? And then you took a completely different track, but also involved with this nature valley farmland.
Yeah, I was, I suppose, in the very beginning, back in 20 years ago, I was just starting my PhD on Thurlocks. But prior to that, when I finished college originally in the late 90s, I worked as an actual reps planner in the Burren from 1997 to 2000. So I was covering areas from West Clare all the way up to South Mayo. And at the time as well, I was also involved in one of the first commonage management plans back when both myself and Andy were young, out around Roundstone, doing one of the first pilot destocking where we mapped 10,000 acres around Roundstone and working out the commonage management plans. And I remember one thing that struck me at the time as a reps planner at the time was how it didn't fit with a lot of the landscapes I was working in that context. And also at the time, I remember going out on farms and everybody got the same money irrespective of the nature value of the farm. And the ones that done best were the ones that cleaned up and tidied up their farms and got rid of the habitats before they actually went into it, you know. So they weren't limited by the amount of semi-natural vegetation that on it. So in a way, I know there was a rule at the time that if you had reclaimed in the last 12 months, you weren't allowed in, but how could that be proved prior to satellites, etc., you know? So I really had the feeling at the time that the rep system really wasn't encouraging this. And even before that, I had read some of the H&V work, and I remember being back in Connemara as well. And the time of the destocking, I remember doing a reps 20-hour training course where the farmers had to be listened and bored to death in the back of a pub for 5 hours a night for 4 nights in a row with what we were talking. I remember sitting in the bar afterwards, and I just happened to mention that I was involved in doing some of the commonage management plans, which was quite bravely at the time back in Turn McKeady, you know. And they said, surprisingly enough, the farmer said, Well, God, James, we thought at the time when they came in first that this was going to be the solution to our problem. There's X over across the mountain there who has 1,000 sheep, you know, and we thought at last someone's going to get control of that guy and cut him down to the 80 that the rest of us have, you know. But he says what he bloody well done was cut everyone by 80%. You cut him down to 200, and you put us out of business altogether and cut us down to 10 sheep each, you know. So from that sort of thing, I always thought at the time we were using a lot of sledgehammers to crack nuts. We weren't valuing what was there. So after a couple of years, the reps plan, I thought, well, I had no influence as a reps planner, bar shouting out the window of the office and threatening to throw the computer out the window quite often, and shouting down the phone at department inspectors, which was getting me nowhere, only an inspection on my farms a couple of weeks later. So I remember going back to college that we'll do a PhD, thinking that when you have a PhD, and naively thinking that academics have some influence on something, you know. So that's where I was then in 2000, is starting the PhD and trying to actually learn and listen and work with farmers and see where we come to at the end of that.
And you went on from that to work at the pioneering project in the Burren?
Yeah, I was lucky enough then at the end of that too, in 2005, to get the job with, I was actually working with Teagasc and seconded to the Burren program as a specialist advisor. So I was at the interface between the program and the 20 farmers on the ground in terms of doing nutrient management plans, farm plans, forage analysis, looking at the condition of water, etc. So I was essentially the jack of all trades, doing the agricultural monitoring, and also at the time I had to do the socioeconomic monitoring as well with staff from the National Farm Survey in Teagasc. But also at the time as well, because I was interested in high nature value farmland, and it was central to the policy in Europe in 2006. It was the first time really in 2006 to 2013 in that rural development program, member states had to put measures in place for high nature value farmland. They had to identify the extent of it in their countries, and they had to put measures in place in their agri-environmental scheme. And I was working, I had a national remit within Sean Regan's Environment Specialist Unit at the time for natural heritage and biodiversity on farmland, with colleagues like Catherine Keena and Eugene Ryan as well. And I remember a bit of a baptism of fire at that stage. So we're just planning Reps 4 in 2005, and I was just looking back on some notes that we had from our original meetings in Teagasc and discussions on that. And interestingly, we were proposing at the time, it didn't go much further than a meeting we had, but we were proposing a complete separate tier for high nature value farmland within Reps 4, you know. All we got was an objective in Reps 4 that high nature value had to be maintained. I didn't get much else beyond an objective in the scheme at the time. So there was, I learned a lot at the time in Teagasc, working with the Burren Life program as well. But again, as Cliona pointed out, there was a lot of frustration there at the time, you know, particularly when we were moving towards the latter end of the program and we were trying to influence the next round of CAP and even the midterm review. An awful lot of people, well, you had unique circumstances in the Burren. There's 10 years of work by Brendan there. You had the cooperation of a unique set of farmers, so it was easy in the Burren. Forgetting what Liam had said earlier on, that it was the most contentious farming area in the whole country as regards farming and conservation, just a couple of years before that.
I think, I mean, looking back, one of the differences leading up to 2013 is that we weren't just commenting about things that had already been decided. We were trying to make a difference to policy. And I think, thinking back, I think that the fact that Burren was there was something that people wanted their own Burren. You know, it wasn't just an imaginary thing anymore. There was real farmers benefiting in a real way from a project that spoke to them. So does anyone want to speak about what we were asking for leading up to 2013?
Well, just to cover that, I think working with Patrick at the time, when Patrick came on board first in 2010, what we'd concentrate on, and not initially Patrick, I think, was looking at the needs of these areas. Were they different? How similar were they to the Burren? Looked like that we had done a few commonage reports. We'd done the case studies in other high nature value farmland areas within the west and northwest of Ireland. And I think at that stage, to us in particular, it was becoming abundantly clear that a lot of what was applied in the Burren could be applied more widely in terms of the partnership model, encouraging local leaders, having scientific research done in local areas, and that sort of actually informing what can be done in them areas and recognizing the diversity of areas across the country. And I remember we spent a lot of time trying to build capacity around that, raising awareness. We even brought the group to Scotland with the Leonardo funding. That time we looked at issues around common land in Scotland and Northern England. And I think we came back from that, and based on the work that Cliona was talking about, but we had a group of researchers across different universities in Teagasc. We had quite a number of advisors too that were quite interested in the high nature value farmland concept, and people that were convinced that what happened in the Burren wasn't just unique to the Burren. It could be applied much more widely. So I think we concentrated on the communities because they were seen as a more difficult one at the time, and covering this quite substantial area of the country as well, over between 300 and 400,000 hectares. We done a report, and Patrick led on this in terms of looking at a results-based payment scheme for the communities. We laid it out in a report, and we had a lot of hope, I think, at the time. In 2012 and 2013, we had an uplands working group. We had all the farm organisations sitting in on this. There was some similar submissions put in by the Heritage Council, the Burren Programme, Teagasc, and others. And we had hope at the time that there would be a substantial sort of move towards results-based in 2013. And also at the time as well, we sort of had the inkling in the back of our minds that people would say, well, we still can't roll it out on a much wider basis. We sort of pushed for that, but we were sort of hedging our bets and thinking that maybe they wouldn't push it out. So we thought about this cooperation article and the scope for maybe running pilots through European innovation partnerships. Now, we weren't calling them European innovation partnerships when we were putting in our submission. We were calling for these sort of partnership pilots that could be rolled out on a wider basis in these areas as well. So that's essentially, I think, where we were in 2013, if I remember correctly. We were convinced a Burren type approach could work, but adapted to different local areas. We thought we could put a framework in place, at least for upland areas, and we worked on getting support for that and where we could go forward with that one.
And we spent a couple of days visiting, myself and James spent a couple of days visiting sites of examples, because there's one I drive round, James, in the Pettigrew Donegal Road.
One of Donegal, yeah.
And there was some rhododendron coming in, and we talked about how this would be relatively easy to cure, under a results-based scheme. I drive past it now, it's covered in rhododendron, like 5 years later. And I just always think to myself, well, obviously nothing worked there in that situation with the policy that was driven. But we supplied ideas that could have worked, but it wasn't taken on board. So, yeah, I think of that when I drive past that site.
So, and you go on.
I was just going to say that one of the big issues that we were kind of struggling with at the time with the Department of Agriculture was their concern about the administrative costs for these more locally based models. And as I say, it got to the point where everybody wanted their Burren program in their area. And we really had to argue that while the administrative costs might look higher, the return, the value for money, was so much better than what you would get from your generic agri environment scheme that it was worth it. But it was considered to be a burden of a model for the Department of Agriculture to try to move forward. But to be fair to them, they did take it on in a slightly labeled slightly differently with the EIPs, where most of them might have had a species specific focus, but they are still supporting, for the most part, that kind of farming.
And when you left the council, which was when, I should check myself,
July 2013.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what did you think? Did you think things had changed for the better? Or
yeah, I thought the atmosphere in that policy interface between agriculture and environmental and ecological professionals was much more positive than when I started. Like, I remember talking to somebody when I was really trying to push things along, talking to a policy person. I was like, this high nature value farming stuff, and they're like, look, farming in the West, it's, that wasn't the attitude 6 years later. It was like, what are we going to do? And there was obviously progress in what was actually being written in the draft ORDP. The EIPs were being talked about. They were in development. It was going to take a few years to roll out. So I thought there was huge progress in 6 years, but at the same time, it can also look like, well, gosh, you just got a few things changed in 6 years. But it was getting very exciting. I felt I was very sorry to leave that policy area when I moved to NPWS. I have to say, because the network was working really well. There was loads of people to collaborate with. There was always somebody you could pick up the phone to say, well, we're struggling with this bit. What do you think? You know, we had pretty good partnerships developed with DAFM, with NPWS particularly. So yeah, I was very sorry to move on from that policy area in 2013, I have to say.
Yes, and at the same time, more or less, that you moved on, we lost the commission funding. So the pot was much smaller. And Patrick, you'd moved by that time to the Tar and Life.
Yeah.
So it was just you and me, James. So, I mean, just explain what we thought our priorities were, given the small amount of resource and manpower that we had. Because one of the things that was different by that time was that there was lots of different things happening in lots of different places, wasn't there? Not just the Burren, not just our life, things in academia, all sorts.
Yeah. So at the time, I suppose we'd gone through the rural development process for 2013. We knew what was going to be in place pretty much for 2014 to 2020. So we knew what we were working with. We knew there was going to be glass that we weren't necessarily very happy with, you know, at the time, you know, that had very little in it. They had made to be honest, a hash of what we proposed on commonages that we knew weren't going to work out, and I think we've been proven right in the intervening 6 years, you know. But I think I had well, it's always in the same policy cycle. When it comes to fruition, when it's eventually implemented, what's decided, I have a sense of frustration in terms of, oh Jesus, we know it's not going to work for another 6 years, you know. So it is. But then I think we took a bit of reflection for about, I think, the first 6 months or so of 2014, while the program was bedded in. We were seeing how the European innovation partnerships in particular were bedding in, you know, and what was potentially going to come from that. And I think the sense at the time was, right, it has worked in the Burren. We have a mechanism to maybe pilot it and show that it could work everywhere else. We need to maybe support as many groups as feasibly possible in H&V farmland areas that we've been working with many of you over the last 10 or 15 years to try and see, can we get something up and running in the existing network of groups that we have, or place that we have. So I think strategically we invested quite an amount of time in a number of groups in terms of helping them with applications, sort of animating what is the potential of these EIPs and working on that through 2014. In the background too as well, I was very much struck, because I was working in academia at that stage for 4 years in IT Sligo, you know, and I was very much struck that there was still a lot of talk of, well, the evidence base isn't there. Show us the evidence that this works, you know. So I think no matter what we'd done on the ground, without having the scientific evidence base to show that this was work and monitoring, we would be in trouble. Now, we had a couple of PhDs at the time, Pamela Boyle and Margaret Hayes, that had worked on high nature value farmland in the West. Their PhDs came to fruition in 2014, 2015. There was a couple of papers out of that. Then we had the Department of Agriculture in 2013, under the Research Stimulus Fund, launched a call. Now, you might say it was 10 years after maybe we needed to have it done, was to map and identify the extent and distribution of high nature value farmland in Ireland. That's where Caroline Sullivan was one of the postdocs in that, as well as Shafiq Matan and other colleagues in Chagas. And from that, over the number of years, while we were working in the backgrounds with the EIPs, we were then trying to quantify and look at it from basically a mapping perspective and distribution, and coming up with what are the various different types. So we were trying to gather the evidence base in the background at the same time to say, right, we definitely wanted to be in 2020 in a situation that we'd all these pilots up and running. They were going to test and prove the Burren model. They were going to adapt it, see if it worked in their areas. We were going to have the evidence base. We had the distribution and extent of high nature value mapped. So if people say, well, what areas do you want this to work in? What is the areas of the country that are H&V? What are the different types? We can now throw papers at them and say, well, it's here, here, and here. We have websites, you know. So it was all about getting together this evidence base. We also wanted to make sure as well, this is some of the work even moving up to last year, to collate the evidence base and communicate it better, because one thing, there's a huge time delay between research and practice on the ground and actually it being implemented in policy. And I think one of the things I've learned in trying to work at the interface here is communications breakdown. Researchers and academia speak different languages to people on the ground and researchers speak different languages to policymakers. We all might want the same thing, but it sounds when we go into a meeting that we're all looking for something slightly different. So we tried to come up with a simple website called Cap for Nature, where we collated the evidence base on this as well. Also, we were working with European partners through the Horizon 2020 program. We had a European network, H&V Link, which was looking at how we improve the socioeconomic viability of these areas. And we've come up with a list of 150 different innovations across governance, social institutional infrastructure, policy reform, farm management techniques, marketing of produce, etc. So at this stage, if anybody says to us, what do we want? We can refer them to numerous websites. Also, the network has evolved. I think this is great work, evolved into the Farming for Nature network. So now it's seen that we have these Farming for Nature ambassadors, we have the Farming for Nature awards. So in the past, these H&B farmers were marginal. There were farmers in the west of Ireland. Yeah, sure, what are they up to? They're not up to much anyway. As you know, it's extensive farming. Sure, we could plant it, and sure, what'd be the loss to the agricultural economy overall, you know? So now we see we're in a very different place, I think, in 2020, particularly with Farming for Nature. There's an awareness of the value of this farming, that particularly in terms of climate change, the carbon stores that are in these areas, the Wide Atlantic Way, in terms of this is the backdrop of the Wide Atlantic Way, all the tourism that goes through that area, that tourism revenue is dependent on this as well. So I think we're at a stage now that, particularly with the EIPs as well, we have shown that this has worked. And now it's slightly adapted in various different areas. I'd say even the burn model itself has morphed into something different. It's more adapted. It's more results focused. Very much the actions are complementing the results. So we have moved on quite a considerable amount. But the challenge, I think, is now, and this is one of the things we were talking about in this meeting, is I think, how do we communicate where we are now? How can we communicate the evidence base that we have? How can we communicate that this is ready to roll out at a much wider basis? So I think we have the evidence base, which is what we decided on 5 years ago. We need that evidence base. We needed a trial in multiple different areas. We needed to take the lessons from that and stick it into the policy in 2020. But now we're at the situation is, where do we go?
Okay. Yeah. Well, we will come, at the end, we'll come to talk about what happens next. But I thought that since we've arrived at today, and maybe we should look back the 20 years now again. So what do you think, well, go around you all, what do you think has changed since 2000? And what challenges do you think still remain? Or what are new challenges? So Patrick, do you want to start?
What has changed? As James says, there's a greater emphasis. There's the range of projects going, which are all different and different. And like when for Our Life, when we were looking at, you know, we had to show that there was no other thing that we could try other than the Life project. Actually now with the EIP, the work is a big thing. I suppose some of the challenges that are worrying me slightly as somebody, both as a farmer and as somebody who general feeling of wilderness and maybe that farming's not as good for wildlife, and maybe, or that farmers are not willing to adapt or whatever, and that there we should be looking at changes of these areas. That's what a concern, and it's probably exaggerated by the number of planting in these areas, that this is looked upon as a better way of dealing with it. I suppose, like at the very beginning, it was in H&V and biodiversity. Now we're starting to look at climate mitigation as well, you know. And that does, I feel, has some issues, because on very low productive systems, you know, particularly grassland systems where they're not putting much output, you know, are they storing as much carbon? And could somebody come and say planting's a better option from a climate mitigation, but it's affecting biodiversity? And I think of that on my own farm at home, where I've got mashed fritillary butterfly and things like that, but I get no yield from it, you know. So what would be the case of planting it? It'd look well, and those are the challenges, I think, in the future, maybe for some of these areas.
One of the projects we didn't mention actually was the results-based pilots, and our colleagues there found the same, that there was sites, you know, where we're Marsh Fertility was mapped, or where species grassland was mapped only a few years ago, and they'd been planted because the environmental impact regulation rules aren't strong enough. Liam, I think when we were preparing for this meeting, you said that one of the embarrassing comments we made in one of the reports that we felt that forestry was the cuckoo in the nest of rural development. And I think that's one thing that hasn't changed, actually, that it really is just the same now as it was then. It's in its own little world, and now it's got this climate button that it thinks it can press, to the detriment of biodiversity and water quality and all sorts. Liam, what do you think when you look back 20 years? What's changed and what's the same?
Yeah, we could have a whole session about forest policy, I think, to be honest. It's extraordinary. But yeah, let's not get deflected. What has changed? I think succinctly for me, and again, I've been removed from this whole, let's say, agri-environment HNV issue for a number of years. I do now get a sense that the nature benefits of low intensity agricultural systems now have a voice, and it's supported by evidence. And I think that's really, really important. You know, I think when we were talking to farmers years ago, 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. So I think that's really important. And again, if you want to ask me what the challenges are, it's related to that. I think when I left the Heritage Council, I moved to the National Biodiversity Data Centre. And I suppose one of the driving forces for me to move on to that was, I thought, build the evidence. You know, let's build the evidence, and we'll see the light. You know, I thought that, you know, collect empirical evidence, or then you know, build a knowledge base on what's happening, and then come up with sensible policy proposal, and hey presto, you'll have a logical policy response. I think what I'm seeing increasingly, maybe I'm just getting more cynical as I get old, like nature conservation and policy is it's a battlefield. And as James says, I mean, we have all the evidence, not all of it. There's a huge body of evidence there. There's a lot of really good work that has happened. You have to have it. You have to have that. But it doesn't, I mean, you know, there are some sectors, shall we say, that seem to be able to get a policy response without evidence. And in fact, where there's evidence to show that what they're proposing will run counter to what you're trying to achieve. So I suppose that's kind of a bit depressing, in that nature conservation still is a battlefield. And okay, we have to find innovative ways to communicate. That's true, but we have to find ways of actually delivery as well. And I'm still, I get kind of pessimistic sometimes, really, about how we can unblock that that policy response.
Cliona, what's the pessimism optimism mix on your part? You need to unmute. You need to unmute.
When in 2000, I was doing my master's in the UK on conservation biology, and I remember one of the lecturers talking about climate change as if it was fact, which I accepted. And a Spanish student in the room said, "Oh, but they're talking about it like it's fact. When I was in university doing my undergrad, this is a theory." And I said, "Yeah, but the science has moved on. You know, it was a theory 10 years ago. It's becoming more accepted now and understood." And when you step forward another 20 years, the awareness amongst the public about the biodiversity and climate change crisis is at a level that I thought for a long time we were never going to get to. At the same time, and this is really building on what Liam said, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric about the Green New Deal and what are we going to do about the biodiversity and climate change crisis. We've seen how quickly the world can act when it wants to in the face of the COVID pandemic. Maybe not as much as we would have liked it to, given the situation with the numbers, but you know, the world can act when it wants to. But we have a lot of work to do to turn the green policy rhetoric into reality over the next few years, and that is still going to be a big challenge. Yeah.
Lorcan Scott, I haven't brought you in yet. You're the current holder of the wildlife officer's post. You weren't there most of the time, so it's not fair to ask you details, but when you listen to the conversation and think about how things are now compared to how they were 20 years ago, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's been fantastic for me listening to how it all evolved. I mean, I would have a general awareness in my days in National Parks and Wildlife Service as a ranger in the east at the time, and the HNV farming, Burn Bio and Arran and all these places were and still are held up in great esteem. But listening to how it all happened and maybe the awkwardness of having to put it together and the problems that were met as it went along, timing does seem to be the missing factor for a lot of it. It probably needed to take that much time for a lot of things to happen, to come to place, so people could understand the processes that were being talked about, the visions and that. I think there is a lot more understanding even by the broader Heritage Council board now. The members will hopefully have a new board shortly, but you can see people are more plugged in. There's a greater awareness and understanding of the crisis of biodiversity and climate change, and that is all helping. You even have people being educated by their children. I'm sure farmers are having their kids coming home from school, explain to them, some of the things that the stakes that are involved if we get this all wrong. And that's where the Heritage Council are at now. We see that there's a moment there if we can support this and get the right outcome with new cap and that. There's fantastic benefits to be had. It's obviously not easy, and from what I've been hearing tonight, communication seems to be a big player in where we're at. You can have the data, you can have the examples and that, but if we're not getting the communications right to the right people, maybe, or this is what we have to explore, where we're not getting our wins from, we're going to miss out again. So that's where we hopefully can, maybe the Heritage Council has a good communications experience and that, and maybe we can bring something to the fight there, and hopefully support fantastic work that you've all been doing for the last 20 years.
James, same question to you really. I'm sure you've got a lot to say about this. Two reflections from me maybe. One thing that I feel is really different now is that there's people in government that are interested and that are doing positive things, which is very different from 20 years ago. National Park and Wildlife, Dúchas, I remember the word was filth really 20 years ago to many people, and through the work of Andy Bleaser and people like that, it's so different now. So that I think is one thing that I noticed from outside that's quite different. And the other thing I think is different now is that Ireland goes and tells the world things now. People get invited from Ireland to come to talk about the good things they're doing, rather than being the ones that are always being chased to do things. It's not all just a bad news story, and it's not just anybody from Ireland, but farmers from Ireland. So we had Michael Daveran come over, to speak to farmers and crofters in Scotland about results-based payments, and he doesn't need any help. He doesn't need a project officer with him. He really believes in it. He knows what it's at. So that's really different, I think. The capacity is changed a lot from what it was. So James, what do you think, looking back over your 20 years of HV farming?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the time of the day. Sometimes I'm in a sort of optimism or pessimism. It's hard to believe it's taken 20 years to get this far, I think what often strikes me, even from the point of view of even the mapping work we done of high nature value farmland in Ireland. I remember looking back on a report, I think you were involved in, Gwyn, back in 2003, and I think he sketched out on the back of an A4 what would be the distribution of H&B farmland in Ireland. And 15 years later, we nearly came up with a map that was identical to that, So I sometimes think we're running to stand still a bit, but when you look back at it, and even looking back on my notes and stuff and files over the last day or so and preparing for this meeting, I think we're in a very different place now in terms of in particular the body of evidence we have, and also in terms of the research community internationally and across the EU and as well. the real value of semi-natural vegetation in general in agriculture, in terms of its value for climate mitigation, pollination, pest control. So that is, it's basically a proven fact now that we need quantities of semi-natural vegetation in farmed landscapes, and they have a valuable role to play. But I still think we're in a situation where the policy is still far behind where we need to be. And one of the things that really gets me is the potential always in CAP. And I think I was maybe very naive, first of all, when I was first involved with Teagasc in 2005, and basically supporting Sean and Eugene and their work and submissions to the department, you know, in terms of what was happening around reps and what we were doing in ourselves in 2013 and 14. But now, and moved on at this stage, I really see that even now, the CAP, the objectives can be all very good. So as you can sort of say anything about the objectives now, they have 9 objectives across the economy, society and environment linked to the sustainable development goals, you know. Then the preamble reads quite well as well in terms of trying to address the challenges. Everything, they say, well, this can be done with X, Y and Z. We see things like agroecology, everything under the sun is thrown into the preambles in terms of good practice, you know. And then we get to the stage, and this is where we're at now in 2019, this stage in the policy cycle always. We have now the European Parliament, which to a certain extent is supporting the Commission in terms of the greening of the CAP, with bringing in more in terms of eco schemes. So in theory, there is the scope there to have it 50-50 in terms of market supports and sustainable development supports. But what's really getting me pessimistic at the moment is what's going to happen when it comes down to the politics in every member state, as well as looking at the minutes of the Council of Ministers meetings for my sins. I don't know why I do it sometimes, you know, but when you look at the minutes of that, you know, so there's the horse trading that goes on, and you know the one single objective is, you know, we want as much of this money for ourselves as possible. How can we transfer the money as quickly as possible? And in a way, it works like a social transfer program rather than actually dealing with the objectives, you know. And this is the one worry I have at the moment. The big challenge we have now is that we're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, you know. The economies are going to be on their knees. We're dealing with issues around climate change, and it will come back to the situation of the economy first. And we even see it now. We cannot be green when we're in the red, you know. But I think we have to create a situation. I think we have the option, in particular in H&B farmlands, we create a situation through the policy, through the incentives, that the pathway out of the red is paved green. You know, and we can. I think we can do this with the policy. Our next 6 months will be crucial, and I think if we have appropriate, good, basic regulation and cross compliance in the CAP, we develop good eco schemes that acknowledge the role of high nature value farmland. Like, we must remember, in Ireland we have 30% of the land base is high nature value farmland. 30% of it is approximately intensive agriculture that has deep fertile soils, that has the potential, with relatively little impact on the environment, to pursue more intensive agriculture. And then we have 30% in the middle. We only ever have the policy designed for the 30% push and intensification, you know. We forget about 60% of the country always. So I think my hope is at the moment that we take into account the diversity of the land base we have, and we have a more balanced approach to the development of the CAP. And I think we can do this. The work we've done on results-based payment schemes, the work that are done in all the local EIDs around the country, I think if we can come together with a clear message within a clear framework in the next 6 months, and I think I can understand the situation from the administrators and the policymakers in the department. They're trying to deal with the complexity of what's coming at them from Europe. They're trying to deal with all these calls from local areas. They know they have a diverse land base, and it's very easy to go with inaction, inertia, and stick with the status quo and stick with your existing administrative systems, you know. It's an awful lot more challenging to be brave and change things. But I think there's enough of us now to be able to support this and be able to actually come up with a system that isn't a big leap, that can work within the administrative structures and can make things better on the ground.
can't believe you're listening to the council ministers. That's just.
I know. It depresses me.
Bismarck
they've been one of my lowest points in the last couple of months.
Bismarck said that laws are like sausages. It's best you don't know how they're made.
Yeah.
Looking from outside now again, we're at a strange situation, aren't we? So the CAP needs assessments are being written as we speak, really. Ireland is being taken to the European Court for its inadequate response to Natura. And at the same time, NPWS has come out with a really comprehensive priority action framework, which sets out things that can be done, and which are very much, written in a way that they can adapt, they can fit into the CAP. Mm-hmm. The EAPs are going well. Everybody likes the EAPs. Everybody thinks they're successful because they're working together, but they're also doing things in a different way, which I think has to be recognized a bit more. And they're supposed to inform the RDP, but it's not very clear how that's going to happen. So, I mean, what do you think the challenges are for the next 12 months? Let's start with you, Patrick.
From an EAP point of view, it is communicating the results of the EAP to the policymakers. That's what we have to do, because, as you say, the policy's been written, but nobody's come to me, and I haven't got the structure as to say, this is what's happening in Ireland, this works, we've got a nice approach we think would work wider. So how do we develop that, and do that? And I suppose that's something as a few of the EAP projects, a large number of them have got together to look at least. But I sort of, if the EAP, if it just continues that we just work and we finish out our term period and rewrite up a nice report, we're not making the impact and policy that we could make. So I think the next challenge is now, and I presume it's really the same challenge that was there the last time as well, is to try to influence policy. And I think it's, Gwyn, we talked about this, like it really is, you just keep banging and you knock a wee bit off the wall, but eventually you get through, and that's just the process. It's not a sledgehammer approach to it.
Past the hour now, so it's time to kind of wrap to an end, really. Lorcan, do you want to say something about how the Hedges Council sees the next 12 months, 18 months?
Yeah, well, certainly, as I mentioned, timing is very important. We are working behind the scenes to try and see if the work, most people here may know about the work of the Farming for Nature Technical Advisory Group and the policy that we've been trying to pull together to influence CAP in its next form and that. So, certainly that is something that the Heritage Council very much supports. The Heritage Board has passed it as something that we'd really like to see done, and we will, in the next short while, try and bring influence where we can to bring that up as a discussion document, to see if we can in some way rebalance some of the information coming to the policymakers. The Heritage Council really values the work of this group, the wider group, and we know that a lot of time and effort has been put into this, and for no return financially, certainly. But we are there for wherever we can fit in going forward. And I have gone to my managers, and they have said, make sure that message goes out loud and clear. We're there for the long run here, and this is very important work. And we're, the Heritage Council in general is very proud of their record there and want to see that going forward.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, looking at the broad picture, something that strikes me, it's one of the objectives of the forum is to raise awareness that this high nature value farming survives at the margins, really. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges that was there at the start and is still with us now, really, is how to break this link between marginality and poverty, let's be honest, and providing high environmental services. So if we can do that, of course, then it'll be a changed world. So I'd like to thank you very much, my colleagues, Patrick McGurn, James Moran, and our sponsors over the years, Lysaght, Cliona O'Brien, and Lorcan Scott. Thanks very much for coming to the webinar. Hope you've enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks very much. See you again. Good night.
Bye.
Right, bye.